Sarah Watson's hands were shaking, but not from the cold. The boy lying in the snow wasn't breathing right. His lips had turned the color of frozen blueberries, and his leg was bent at an angle that made her stomach turn. She pressed 2 fingers against his neck, searching for a pulse, and felt the faint flutter of life still fighting beneath his skin. Around her, streets were empty, the kind of empty that makes you realize how alone you really are. She'd walked this route 1,000 times after her shifts at Joe's diner, but tonight the universe had dropped a dying child at her feet like a test she never asked to take. The emergency tag dangling from his jacket read 1 name and 1 number. Mr. Powell. Her fingers fumbled with her phone, the screen blurry through the falling snow. When the call connected, the voice that answered didn't ask questions like a normal parent would. It was deep, controlled, the kind of voice that gave orders and expected them followed. "Where are you?" he said. Sarah's breath came out in white clouds. "Corner of Wexler and Pine. He's losing consciousness. His leg is broken, maybe worse. I've stabilized it, but he needs a hospital now." There was a pause, just long enough for her to hear something shuffle in the background. Then the voice came back, colder than the wind cutting through her thin jacket. "Stay there. Don't let anyone touch him. I'm coming." The line went dead. Sarah looked down at the boy, his small chest rising and falling in shallow gasps. She'd been a physiotherapy student once, before her father was locked away for crimes she still didn't understand, before her mother's health collapsed under the weight of shame and poverty, before dreams became luxuries she couldn't afford. Now she worked double shifts slinging hash browns and coffee, her hands remembering the anatomy she once studied, her mind trying to forget everything else. But muscle memory doesn't lie. She knew how to keep this child alive at least for a few more minutes. The SUVs arrived like wolves, black and sleek, their headlights cutting through the snowfall with surgical precision. Doors opened and men stepped out, not paramedics but something else entirely. They moved with military efficiency, dressed in dark clothes that looked expensive even in the dim streetlight. And then he emerged from the second vehicle, tall and broad-shouldered, his face carved from the same granite as the Chicago skyline behind him. James Powell didn't run to his son. He walked, each step measured and deliberate, like a man who'd trained himself never to show panic even when his world was ending. He knelt beside the boy, his hand hovering over the child's face but not quite touching, as if afraid his fingers might break something already broken. Then his eyes shifted to Sarah, and she felt the full weight of his attention. It was like being studied by a predator deciding whether you were prey or competition. "What did you do?" he asked. Sarah swallowed hard. "I immobilized his leg with my scarf and kept his airway clear. He needs a trauma center. His body temperature is dropping fast." James studied the makeshift splint, then looked back at her with something that might have been respect if his face knew how to form that expression. "You saved my son," he said simply. "I owe you." Before Sarah could respond, he was already lifting the boy with a gentleness that seemed impossible for hands that large. The men surrounded them, forming a human shield as they moved toward the vehicles. Sarah stood there in the snow, watching them prepare to leave, and realized she was still holding the boy's small glove that had fallen when she checked his pulse. She took a step forward. "Wait," she called out. "Take him to Northwestern Memorial. They have the best pediatric trauma unit and—" James turned, the boy cradled against his chest. "I have my own doctors. But thank you." He paused, snowflakes catching in his dark hair. "What's your name?" "Sarah. Sarah Watson." Something flickered across his face, too fast to read. Then he nodded once and climbed into the SUV. The convoy pulled away, leaving Sarah alone on the corner with wet knees and a feeling that her life had just tilted off its axis in a direction she couldn't see yet. The next morning she woke to knocking that didn't stop. When she opened the door of her run-down apartment, a man in a pressed suit stood there holding an envelope like it contained something more important than paper. "Miss Watson," he said. "Mr. Powell requests your presence." Sarah's landlord chose that moment to appear in the hallway, eyes wide with the kind of curiosity that would fuel gossip for weeks. She grabbed her jacket and followed the man downstairs to where a black car idled at the curb, looking obscenely out of place among the rust and broken concrete of her neighborhood. The drive took them out of her world and into another one entirely. The Powell mansion rose behind iron gates like something from a different century, all stone and glass and the kind of money that didn't need to announce itself. Inside everything was cold elegance and locked doors. Sarah counted 3 guards before she stopped counting. The man in the suit led her through hallways that seemed designed to make you feel small until they reached an office where James Powell sat behind a desk that probably cost more than her year's rent. He stood when she entered, which surprised her. "Ethan is stable," he said without preamble. "Because of you." Sarah crossed her arms. "Is that why you brought me here? To say thank you?" "No." He walked around the desk and she noticed he moved like someone who'd been in too many fights to ever feel truly relaxed. "I brought you here to offer you a job. Ethan needs rehabilitation for his leg. I want you to oversee it." Her heart kicked hard against her ribs. "I'm not a physiotherapist. I dropped out. But you were training to be one. And you have instincts that saved my son's life." He named a salary that made her knees weak. "You'll live here during his recovery. Room and board included. The work is 3 months, maybe 4. Sarah's mind raced through calculations. That money could pay for her mother's treatments, clear their debts, maybe even let her go back to school. But something about this felt wrong, like a trap disguised as salvation. "Why me?" she asked. "You have money. You could hire the best therapists in the country." James's expression didn't change, but his eyes did, going darker somehow. "Because Ethan trusts you. And because I pay my debts." He should have said no. Every instinct screamed that this man was dangerous, that his world had teeth she couldn't see. But her mother's last medical bill sat unpaid on her kitchen counter, and survival doesn't care about instincts. "Okay," Sarah heard herself say. "I'll do it." She moved into the mansion that afternoon, her entire life fitting into 2 suitcases that looked pathetic in the bedroom they gave her. The room was bigger than her apartment, with windows that overlooked gardens still beautiful even under snow. But it felt like a cage made of silk, and every locked door she passed reminded her that she was a guest in a fortress built to keep secrets in and questions out. Ethan Powell was 8 years old and quiet in the way children get when they've learned that being loud brings problems. His leg was casted and elevated, his face still pale from the trauma. But when Sarah entered his room that first day, he smiled at her like she was a superhero who'd dropped from the sky. "You're the snow angel," he said softly. "Dad said you saved me." Sarah sat beside his bed, her heart breaking a little. "You're pretty tough, Ethan. You did half the saving yourself by hanging on." Over the next few weeks, she fell into a rhythm that felt almost normal. She worked with Ethan every day, helping him through exercises that would keep his muscles strong while the bone healed. He was smart and sweet, asking her questions about everything from anatomy to why the sky changed colors. She found herself telling him stories about her father, carefully editing out the parts about prison and injustice, focusing instead on the man who'd taught her that knowledge was the only thing no one could steal. But James Powell remained a shadow in the house, appearing and disappearing according to patterns she couldn't predict. When he was there, the air felt heavier, charged with something dangerous. He watched her work with Ethan from doorways, never interfering, his face unreadable. Sometimes she caught him looking at her with an expression that seemed almost like pain, but then it would vanish and he'd be cold granite again. One night she was walking back from Ethan's room when she heard voices from below. 2 guards stood near the stairwell, speaking in low tones that carried up through the marble halls. "He's meeting Senator Cole again tomorrow," one said. "Probably about that old case." The other guard laughed quietly. "The Watson thing. Thought that was buried years ago. Guess some graves don't stay closed." Sarah froze on the stairs. Watson. Her father's name. Her father's case. The coincidence was impossible, but the certainty hit her like a fist to the chest. These men were talking about her father. About his case. About something James Powell was still involved with years after her father had died in prison, maintaining his innocence until his last breath. She made it back to her room before her legs gave out, sitting on the edge of the bed with her mind racing through implications she didn't want to see. It couldn't be. The universe wasn't that cruel, that perfectly designed to destroy her. But the pieces were clicking together with horrible clarity. Powell Industries. Her father had been an accountant for a company with that name. A company whose money laundering he'd tried to expose before he was arrested and charged with the very crimes he'd been reporting. Sarah waited until 3 in the morning, when the mansion fell asleep even though she knew guards still patrolled. She'd watched their patterns for weeks without realizing she was gathering intelligence. Now she used it, slipping through hallways with the key card she'd seen James use to access his private office. Her hands shook as she swiped it, half expecting alarms, but the door simply clicked open. The office was dark and smelled like expensive leather and old secrets. Sarah used her phone's flashlight to search, checking drawers and cabinets with the desperate efficiency of someone running out of time. Most were locked, but she found a letter opener in his desk and used it to jimmy open a filing cabinet that looked older than the others, the kind of place people hide things they want to forget but can't quite destroy. The folder was thin, marked only with a date from 7 years ago. Inside were court documents, police reports and newspaper clippings all about the same case. United States versus George Watson. Her father's name stared up at her from the page, along with charges of embezzlement, money laundering and fraud. But it was the corporate letterhead that made her blood turn to ice. Powell Industries. And there, in the list of executives who'd testified against her father, was James Powell's signature. Sarah's vision blurred with tears she refused to let fall. The man whose son she'd saved, the man who'd offered her salvation, the man whose home she'd been living in for weeks was the same man who'd destroyed her family. James Powell hadn't just been involved in her father's case. He'd been the one who'd made sure George Watson took the fall. Every document screamed it. Her father had been the accountant who'd discovered illegal activity in Powell Industries, and instead of being protected for trying to do the right thing, he'd been framed as the criminal. She was still standing there, holding evidence of her own destruction, when the office lights blazed on. James stood in the doorway wearing the same clothes from earlier, like he'd never gone to bed. His eyes moved from her face to the folder in her hands, and something in his expression cracked. "You should have told me you were curious," he said quietly. "I would have shown you." Sarah's voice came out raw and broken. "You ruined my family. You had my father locked away for your crimes. He died in prison calling your name, begging someone to listen to check the records one more time. And you let him rot." James took a step into the room and she backed up, holding the folder like a shield. "Watch your tone," he said, but there was no heat in it. "Watch my tone." Sarah's laugh was sharp enough to cut. "You watch your soul if you still have one. My father died for something you did. My mother lost her mind trying to prove his innocence. I lost everything. And you were the man who made it happen." His face changed then, not with guilt but with something that looked like genuine shock. "Your father," he said slowly, "George Watson. He was my accountant. He came to me 7 years ago with proof that someone inside the company was stealing, laundering money through offshore accounts. He had documents, recordings, everything we needed to go to the authorities. I told him I'd handle it, that I'd protect him." Sarah's chest heaved. "You protected him straight into a cell." "No." James crossed to his desk and pulled open a different drawer, this one unlocked. He threw down a photograph that slid across the polished surface. "That's your father, right? Standing next to that man." Sarah looked at the photo. Her father, younger and smiling, stood beside a man she didn't recognize. Tall, blonde, with the kind of smile that didn't reach the eyes. "Victor Hale," James said. "My right-hand man back then. The person I trusted most in the world besides my son." His voice went hard. "The next day after your father came to me, George disappeared. Just vanished. The police found evidence of embezzlement in his accounts, transfers he swore he didn't make, documents with his signature. I thought he'd gotten scared and run, maybe even taken money to disappear. I never thought that he was innocent." Sarah cut in. "That someone might have framed him?" James's jaw clenched. "Victor came to me with all the evidence. Said George had confessed everything before running. I believed him because I'd known Victor for 10 years. Your father I'd only worked with for 6 months." He looked down at the photograph. "I didn't know Victor had used your father to cover his own theft. I didn't know George died in prison. I didn't know." He stopped, meeting her eyes. "I didn't know he had a daughter who'd grow up to save my son." Sarah wanted to hate him. Needed to hate him. But the exhaustion in his voice sounded real, and worse, she'd spent weeks watching him with Ethan, seeing the cracks in his armor. "Where is Victor Hale now?" she asked. James's expression went cold in a way that reminded her exactly who she was talking to. "Still in my organization. Still trusted by most people who work for me." He paused. "Still feeding information to the police, trying to dismantle everything I've built. I've suspected for months. Now I know why." Sarah's mind raced. "You're saying the man who framed my father is still here? Still working for you? Not for much longer." James pulled out his phone and made a call, speaking in low tones about shipments and locations and timing. When he hung up, he looked at Sarah with an intensity that made her skin prickle. "I'm going to prove I'm telling you the truth. Victor thinks he's untouchable because he's been my friend for years. Tomorrow night I'm setting a trap. And you're coming with me." "Why would I go anywhere with you?" "Because if I'm lying you'll know. And if I'm telling the truth, you'll finally have justice for your father." He held out his hand. "Either way, you deserve to see how this ends." Sarah stared at his outstretched hand, thinking about her father, about the years of pain, about the boy upstairs who smiled at her like she'd hung the moon. She thought about trust and betrayal and the way the universe makes you choose between impossible options. Then she took James's hand and felt the calluses on his palm that matched her own. "If you're lying to me," she said quietly, "I'll make sure the world knows everything." James almost smiled. "If I'm lying to you, I'll deserve whatever you do to me." The trap was set for the following night at the industrial docks south of the city, where Lake Michigan met rust and abandoned warehouses. James had leaked information about a shipment of money being moved, coordinates and timing sent through channels he knew Victor monitored. Now they waited in the cold dark, Sarah tucked into the passenger seat of an unmarked car while James's men positioned themselves in the shadows. "Why bring me?" Sarah asked, watching the docks through the windshield. James didn't look at her. "Because you need to see the truth with your own eyes. And because if this goes wrong, someone needs to know the whole story." "That's not reassuring." "It wasn't meant to be." They waited in silence until headlights appeared on the access road. Not police cruisers but a single black sedan moving too fast. It skidded to a stop near the warehouse and a man got out, looking around with the jerky movements of someone who knew they were walking into something bad but couldn't stop themselves. "That's him," James said. "Victor." Sarah watched as Victor Hale ran toward the warehouse, carrying what looked like computer drives. He was older than in the photograph, his hair thinner, but she'd know that face anywhere now. It was the face that had stood beside her father in what she'd thought were happy memories. The face that had smiled while destroying an innocent man. James gave a signal and lights blazed from every direction. Police surrounded the building, their presence confirming what Sarah had suspected. James had brought them in on this, turned his own trap into something official. But Victor didn't freeze like a normal person caught in the act. He pulled a gun and fired toward the nearest officer. Everything happened too fast. James was out of the car and moving, Sarah scrambling after him even though every instinct said to stay hidden. She watched him approach Victor with the calm of someone who'd done this 100 times, his own weapon drawn but not raised. "It's over, Victor," James called out. "The drives you're carrying? Copies. The real evidence is already with the FBI." Victor's laugh was ugly. "You think this ends anything? You built your empire on blood, James. Every dollar you have came from people like me doing your dirty work. Then I'll end it with justice." James threw something toward Sarah. A bag filled with more computer drives. "Those will clear George Watson's name. Everything Victor did, it's all there." Sarah caught the bag, her hands shaking. Victor saw the exchange and his face twisted with rage. He raised his gun, aiming not at James but at her, and she saw her death in his eyes. The shot exploded through the night, but it was James who stumbled, putting himself between the bullet and her body. He went down hard, blood spreading across his shirt like a dark flower blooming. Sarah dropped beside him, her training kicking in even as her mind screamed. She pressed her hands against the wound, feeling hot blood pulse between her fingers. "Don't you dare die," she choked out. "Not after what you did. Not after what you're trying to fix." James looked up at her, his face pale but his eyes still sharp. "You really don't scare easily, do you? Shut up and stay conscious." She could hear police shouting, could see Victor being tackled to the ground. But all that mattered was keeping pressure on the wound and keeping James's eyes open. "You owe me answers. You owe me the truth. You don't get to die before you pay that debt." His hand came up, covering hers where it pressed against his chest. "The truth was in that office all along. I just didn't know what I was looking at." He coughed, wincing. "Your father was a good man. I'm sorry I didn't believe him." The ambulance arrived with sirens that sounded like the end of the world. Paramedics pulled her away from James, taking over with practiced efficiency. Sarah stood there covered in his blood, watching them load him into the ambulance, and realized she was crying without knowing when the tears had started. A week later, every news channel in Chicago ran the same story. Evidence had emerged clearing George Watson of all charges related to the Powell Industries case. Victor Hale, a trusted executive, had confessed to embezzlement and framing an innocent man. The district attorney announced a full investigation. Sarah's father's name, dragged through mud for 7 years, was finally clean. Sarah sat in her mother's hospital room, reading the articles aloud while her mother cried and smiled and cried some more. He was right, her mother kept saying. George was right all along. He was innocent. That afternoon, a nurse found Sarah in the waiting room and said someone wanted to see her. She followed to a private wing where James Powell sat up in bed, bandaged and pale but alive. He held out a sealed envelope when she entered. "Your father wrote this," he said quietly. "Years ago, before everything went wrong. It was in my mail after he disappeared, but Victor told me it was just a resignation letter. I never opened it." He paused. "I should have." Sarah took the letter with shaking hands and unfolded pages that still smelled faintly of her father's cologne. The handwriting was his, careful and precise, the way he taught her to write. The words made her knees buckle. "Dear Mr. Powell, if you're reading this, something has gone wrong. I'm writing to thank you for trying to protect me and to ask one more favor. I have a daughter, Sarah. She's 17 and brilliant and kind. If anything happens to me, if she ever needs help and finds her way to you, please keep her safe. Please help her finish her education. She wants to heal people. Don't let my mistakes destroy her future. Sincerely, George Watson." Sarah's vision blurred completely. Her father had trusted James Powell even after being betrayed. Had believed enough in goodness to ask the man whose company had destroyed him to protect his daughter. The tragedy of it was overwhelming. "He thought you'd help me," she whispered. James nodded slowly. "And I will. However long it takes." Months passed. The snow melted into spring and Sarah visited the mansion one final time. Ethan was running through the gardens, his leg healed, his laugh carrying through open windows. James stood on the balcony watching his son, and when Sarah joined him she saw something different in his face. Peace maybe. Or the shadow of it at least. "I'm shutting it down," he said without looking at her. "Powell Industries, the offshore accounts, everything that made money the wrong way. It'll take years, but I'm done." Sarah nodded. "That's good. I can't undo what I've done. Can't bring your father back or give you those years." He finally met her eyes. "But I can stop doing it. Stop being the person who lets good people fall. That's all the justice my father would have wanted." She turned to leave, ready to walk away from this chapter and into whatever came next. "Sarah," he called after her. She looked back. "If you want to finish your studies, become the physiotherapist you trained to be, I'll fund it. No strings. No expectations. Just keeping a promise to a good man who deserved better." Sarah felt a smile pull at her lips, small but real. "I'll finish it myself. That's how redemption works. You earn it with your own hands." She walked down the steps and through the gardens where spring was turning everything green again. Behind her she heard Ethan call out to his father, heard James's rare laugh in response. The sound followed her all the way to the gates, where she turned and looked back one final time at the fortress that had held both her destruction and her salvation. James Powell stood on the balcony still, watching her go, and for the first time since she'd met him, his face held something that looked like hope. It was fragile and new, but it was there. And Sarah understood that some stories don't end with happiness or tragedy, but with the simple possibility that broken people might learn to build something better from the pieces. She walked into the sunlight, her father's letter folded in her pocket, her mother waiting at home, her future uncertain but finally her own again. The past would always hurt, but it didn't have to be a prison anymore. For her or for the man she was leaving behind. That was enough. That was justice. That was the beginning of something that might one day feel like peace. Thank you for watching this story. Please like and subscribe to my channel.